Welcome to the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. The Invisible Wheelchair Podcast was selected by FeedSpot as one of the top 10 obsessive-compulsive disorder podcasts. I'm Donald Grodoff, EFT tapping practitioner and OCD coach at FamilyOCD.com. On the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast, I focus on the hidden world of OCD and anxiety with interviews and information around this topic. My purpose is to bring about awareness of OCD, those who treat OCD, and of course, those who suffer with OCD. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is a treatable and manageable disorder. In my practice at FamilyOCD.com, I guide people through the process of ERP therapy and other alternative treatments. If you know of someone suffering with OCD, simply visit FamilyOCD.com. If you or someone you know suffers or has suffered and recovered from OCD and would like to get their story out, simply contact us through www.invisiblewheelchair.com. We want to talk to you and get your story out on the podcast. Know that the ideas and thoughts presented here are not necessarily those of Family OCD, Invisible Wheelchair Podcast, or Donald Grodoff. We also ask you to take just a few moments and leave comments at www.invisiblewheelchair.com. Those comments help us to know what the next topic should be, and we really want to hear from you. Now, let's get to that podcast. This podcast was recorded October 18th, 2020. This is podcast number 49. There's ticking and it's not the clock. So today what I want to talk about was tics, T-I-C-S, and Tourette's syndrome, because there's a connection there between the two. And I know myself, I've known a lot of OCD people that had tics as part of their OCD, and I think it's kind of a chicken and egg kind of syndrome as to which came first or which happens because of the other. Now, the research I've done is based on two different places. One is the IOCDF, the International OCD Foundation's website, and the other is a Texas Children's Hospital report they did based on tics and Tourette's. So I wanted to give some information because I know there are a lot of people, especially with OCD, that suffer with tics. And to a lot of them, I believe it has led to Tourette's syndrome. And what I see is the difference of the two. Tics are what usually start out, and tics can be either bodily happenings, functions like actions that happen in the body, movements, or they're verbal, phonic, I think is what they called them in this. You can see that with a tic, it's a movement. I'm going to go over different types of tics. There are 4 different styles of tics. Simple motor, which again is just sudden, quick movements that involve a limited number of muscles and are usually repetitive. So it happens, and they mention a couple here, and I'll mention them here, and I'm going to go over some more in a minute, but eye blinking, grimacing, shoulder shrugging, and head jerking. Then there's simple phonic, which is the verbalized ones. These tics are when sounds are made, throat clearing, burping, coughing, yelping, sniffing. Complex motor, movements that last longer and seem more powerful, or purposeful, Examples are smelling things, jumping, touching or hitting others, self-injurious behaviors, so injuring yourself. Complex phonic are tics that are involving repeating sounds or phrases nonsensically. Examples, emitting words or phrases out of context, counting things out loud, or more rarely, vocalizing socially unacceptable words. And that's one I've seen with cursing, using vulgar words, not not by their own purpose, but just involuntary. Now, the difference that I see in what I've reading and I've read about tics versus Tourette's is tics are usually what start out first, and when they become chronic, when you've been doing them both types for over a year, they then move into what's considered Tourette's syndrome. And I'll read the definition of Tourette's syndrome as it's by the IOCDF. Tourette's syndrome, TS, or Tourette's disorder, is a childhood neuropsychiatric, which is mental and nervous system disorder that involves multiple tics, repetitive sudden movements, motor tics, and vocal outbursts, which are phonic tics, that seem largely outside the person's control. TS is one kind of a spectrum of tic disorders that includes transient tics, tics of less than a year duration, and chronic tics, typical tics lasting more than a year. So, as I understand it from what I've studied here, what I've looked at here, is again, you start out with the tics, and as they become repetitive and they go on longer than a year, then you move into being diagnosed with the Tourette's syndrome. And there is the possibility that it is involved in genes, that it can have some hereditary factors to it. The unfortunate part is it hasn't really been studied as much as it needs to be. And it's believed to be, and to be a basic dysfunction in the brain. Again, very much similar probably to what OCD does, is there's a misfunctioning of how the brain functions. But again, they haven't done too many studies on it. Now, coming off of the Texas Children's Hospital, I'm going to read a list of the different types of tics. So in the simple motor tics, there's blinking or squinting, grimacing, nose twitching, head neck jerking, shrugging, arm and hand movements, abdominal tensing, rapid jerking of any part of the body. And again, I've actually worked with two different people in the, not that that's a lot, but I've worked with them in basically this more simple motor tics. And what it feels like to me, or what I've seen with what I've done with these two patients I work with, we were able to bring down the amount of tics, but I use the alpha stim, which is a brain stimulation, frequency stimulation device that I work with. It's real mild in what it does. It's not a shock treatment, but it really helped to control or bring down the amount of tics. And I think in doing that, it would then help it from becoming something like the Tourette's syndrome. Let me continue to read. Examples of more complex motor tics include eye movements, rolling upwards and downwards or side to side, touching, rubbing, and tapping objects or people, sticking out the tongue or lip biting, clapping, throwing, and pinching, kissing or silly facial expressions, bending or gyrating, imitating movements, making obscene gestures. And it does say here that that's rather rare, thank God. And the examples of simple and complex vocal tics, also called phonic tics, include throat clearing, coughing, sniffing and snorting, whistling or hissing, grunting or gurgling, squeaking or screeching, animal or bird noises, phrases like "shut up, stop that, wow, that's it," sudden changes in volume or pitch, repeating sounds or phrases, obscenities, and again they say that is rare, as it but I have seen that. I've seen somebody that actually cursed, and it comes out very very guttural, very quick, and very blunt, and it doesn't fit the context of anything, which is basically what they mentioned here. Um, they talk about when the tics begin, when it really happens, and from what I've seen in both the places I was doing the reviewing of, it looks like it's usually in elementary to high school, and so it's fairly young that these things come about. Now, I'll read what the Texas Children's Hospital report said about the differences between tics and Tourette's syndrome. The movement and vocalizations are called tics. A formal diagnosis of Tourette's syndrome is met when at least 1 year has passed since the onset of the first tic, and the patient has experienced at least one phonic tic and at least two motor tics. Many people with tics will eventually meet the criteria for Tourette's syndrome. But I think, at the same sense, I think that it doesn't necessarily have to lead to Tourette's. I remember years ago when I was in sales, I worked with a gentleman who was constantly clearing his throat. And I realize now, didn't know it then. It was actually very frustrating. He was a great person, but it was very annoying. I had to work with him in close proximity, a lot of times traveling places, making calls with him. I was in sales, and all the while that we drove, it was just a constant kind of noise over and over, very repetitive. And then he would stop for a little bit, and then he would start back over again. Um, I dealt with it because he was a really nice gentleman to work with, and I actually was kind of friends. He helped me out in a lot of ways. But it is very frustrating. Like I say, it comes very much out of context, especially the phonic or vocal ones. So they there's a little bit of a difference in OCD versus tics. But now let's just know that tics a lot of times are part of OCD. And they also say that really that Tourette's syndrome is really a subset of tics. So I would have thought about it the other way, and it kind of sounds more like it, that it's the other way, that Tourette's tics are a subset of Tourette's, but it really sounds like the Tourette's is the tics being slowly evolved into Tourette's. But one of the differences they talk about with OCD versus tics, that tics are done because of a bodily discomfort, versus where OCD, the behaviors with OCD are done because of a thought process. So there is a difference there. They talk about treatment, and they mention that there are drugs that can help. They talk about the fact that it's really important, as in OCD, it's important to reach out and find sources that have experience with Tourette, that know how to deal with it, that those are your best sources. They talk about CBT, or talk therapy. They also talk about the idea of really about communication and education. Having people understand what's going on makes it a little easier for the person, because I can imagine, and I know from the people that I've worked with and I've met or seen that have that issue, it's kind of an embarrassing place for them to be, because they can't control it. It's not in their control. And that's a tough place for people to understand. They think that you can control that or stop that. But it's this stuff coming so out of context, sometimes, with language that isn't appropriate. So being open and understanding about it, helping others to understand what it is, educate your family, educate the friends and people around, let people know what's going on so that they can better understand it. And I know, again, not to do this as a plug, but to know that I've worked with it with tics. Haven't worked with Tourette's as of that I know of, that I remember anyway. But I worked with it using this alpha stim, which I think I've talked about in some of the podcasts. But I have found that it did with the two patients that I worked with, two clients, I'm sorry, that it helped reduce the tics and help them better control the tics. Now, I only worked with each of them for a period of about 2 or 3 months, and like I say, we showed reduced tics and reduced amounts and frequencies of those tics in the time that I worked with them. And then, of course, they also bought the alpha stem, and I haven't really been able to follow up with them as far as what they're doing with it. But I believe, from what I've seen, and like I said, dealing with the gentleman a long time ago who I knew for quite a few years, I believe that it doesn't necessarily have to lead into Tourette's. I think that is, there's probably a proportion of the cases of tics that lead into Tourette's, but that doesn't mean they all do. And I think it's something, it sounds like, just like in OCD, it sounds like something that is manageable in some way, shape, or form and might be able to be reduced. They really say in most of the stuff I have read so far and understand that they don't believe there is a necessary cure for it, but that again, it is manageable. So my suggestions would be a couple of things. One is if you are suffering from tics right now, is one, to find a doctor that specializes in tics. And I would start in the IOCDF, the foundation, the International OCD Foundation, which is iocdf.org. You could probably find a physician there that knows OCD and that may understand and know tics. Another place you may want to investigate is Dr. Charles Mansueto, Mansueto. He has the Behavior Therapy Center based in Silver Springs, Maryland, and he has done some reporting and some research on the tics and Tourette syndromes. He wrote an article at the IOCDF Foundation website, and as I explored his Behavior Therapy Center, I found he's done some work in that. It's someplace. And finally, you want to check out the Tourette Association of America, and that's at tourette.org. Very simple, TOURETTE.org for more information. So they've got a lot of tools and information there. There's some events going on. You can find providers there, and that's what I'm talking about. Again, just like OCD, you want to make sure to find somebody that understands it, that has worked with it, that has been involved in it, because like OCD, it's not something that you can, if you haven't been involved in it, if you haven't had it happen to you or worked with people with it, you don't know what to do. And so there's a good place there to find providers for it. So I hope this has helped some to bring about some awareness about tics and Tourette's and what it could do and what it is like. So I hope this has helped, and I thank you for listening once again. Take care. This concludes this podcast. We really would appreciate your comments. Simply leave a comment at www.invisiblewheelchair.com. There, you're able to submit a comment that will help us determine future podcasts. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the podcast, please email Don at invisiblewheelchair.com. Remember, there is a corresponding tapping recording for each of the podcasts with the exception of the interview podcast. You can find these tapping recordings and archived past podcasts at www.invisiblewheelchair.com. Finally, there is relief for OCD, and we at FamilyOCD.com and FocusedHealthyFamily.com can help you find that relief. Again, you can contact us through those sites, FamilyOCD.com or FocusedHealthyFamily.com. You can also find us on Facebook at Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at InvisibleWheel1, that's the number 1, or at FamilyOCD. So thank you for listening. Keep tapping and transcending your life to new heights.